Well, we finally did it. We got all of these. It's actually from several events, but the important one is this one. You may not be able to see it very well, but that does in fact say champion. Maybe I'll edit in the image later. Finally got a takedown of a complete victory, first place at one of my store showdowns. And I've been top 8ing several of these, as well as I top 8'd a recent 1K. And I did it with Boba Yellow. Now, I wanted to talk about the deck. There have been a number of other people who have shown a spotlight, put this deck under the microscope, but I figured I'd go out there, put in my 2 cents on the build, and hopefully help some other people with the remaining store showdowns, or at least the rest of the set 1 meta. Let's get into it. So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this screen, but this is the deck. I'll, of course, have a link to it down in the description of the video, somewhere thereabouts, like and subscribe button. Getting those in while I can. You can also find links to my Discord as well as my live stream, which I am going to try and put more Star Wars Unlimited on my actual Twitch stream. Just getting that out there as well in case people weren't sure from some of the other videos. But this is we'll call it the KTOD list, the one that Bobby Sapphire done so well with. But I did want to give a shout out to also Poem, and you can call me Al. They were playing this for a while, and I believe that was where I first really started getting interested. I mean, I saw the deck list, and to be honest, my introduction to it was because I knew I wanted to play Boba Fett. He's my favorite character in the Star Wars universe, and I just don't have Vaders. I think that's a refrain that a lot of people have said since the inception of the game. I made the mistake of thinking, well, Vader's kind of high, but if the product holds out, the price will come down. And it is now, but it was kind of bad there for a while. So I was looking for other ways to play Boba Fett. I stumbled on variants of this list. And to be honest, this list, other than the Swoop Racers, is pretty close to one of the original ones that I saw. And I've gone through a number of iterations and then came back to this one. As mentioned a little while ago, I'm not going to go through all the cards. I will reference them, of course, but I want to talk more about the general ethos of the deck and its matchups and things like that, because you can definitely check out other creators' videos for the individual card breakdowns, but definitely let me know if you want to hear my thoughts on it. I'd be happy to do a follow-up video. Let's talk about Boba Yellow as a cohesive whole. This is at its core, and everywhere else as well, an aggro deck. It's been labeled on many occasions as aggro tempo. Now, the tempo piece may have thrown you off if you played other games, because at least for me, when I saw that, I started conjuring to mind a fairly different play pattern. Aggressive, yes, but not nearly as aggressive as this deck actually turns out to be. This deck is way closer to Sabine than a lot of people may be willing to accept. It just happens to use bounce instead of having direct damage in order to ensure that you continue to apply pressure. And applying pressure is the key component. You're going to hear that repeated as we get into the different matchups and other thoughts that I have. Every turn you must be playing a threat or producing a way to push damage onto your opponent. If you take your foot off the gas, even for a turn, a lot of the power level from other builds will bleed through and then steal your tempo, flip the game in their favor, and this deck does not play well from behind. Once your board is clear or in a disadvantageous position, you're going to have a steep hill to climb to try and close the game out. It's not impossible, but it's going to be very, very difficult. Key things to keep in mind, and again, I will repeat this as we go through, but you want to ensure that you have a consistent curve from turn 1 until the turn the game ends. So you really, really need to prioritize mulliganing for the traditional Sly curve. That is a 1-drop into a 2-drop, into a 3-drop, into a 4-drop, with the caveat that you want to interweave the way to abuse the Boba resource manipulation. One of the most powerful things you can do in card games, full stop, any card game, is abuse the resource system. You're doing something that the game fundamentally does not want you to do, because all of the cards are designed and built around they come out on this turn. And the way Star Wars Unlimited plays right now, probably alone, a lot of decks are just playing one guy, doing some combat, and then somebody's claiming initiative. Boba allows you to break that unwritten rule and play multiple cards in a single turn when the other decks may just be blanking, let alone playing multiple cards. So you want to first make sure you're curving out. Second, look for opportunities both when you're considering your mulligans as well as each turn of the game, does my set of cards, does my hand add up to current number of resources plus 1, or on the Boba turn when things start really getting crazy, 8 resources. After that, it's of course resources plus 2. Those are your explosive plays, and that is how you're going to close out games and set up all of those crazy cunnings and things where all of a sudden you're swinging for double digits and your opponent may not even have a board. But let's talk about the different decks and how you can engineer those scenarios. First up, we're going to start with things in the same category. You, of course, have Sabine. You also have Leia, and we're going to lump in other Boba Yellows, the Mirror, as well, because, of course, as mentioned, it is an aggro deck, and realistically, you're going to play all 3 matchups very similarly. On the outskirts, there might be Grand Inquisitors or other things like that, and I imagine they're going to go about the same, but let's be honest, they haven't really shown up all that much. So what do you have to do in these matchups? Well, there are a few key cards, and this one's going to be a broken record, but cunning. It does so much. I joke about it all the time, but this card has way too much text on it that is relevant for it to be a bad card, and it is something you want to see in every single matchup, but especially here. Imagine this setup. Your opponent has 2 bodies out, maybe one of them is Sabine, and they just played a K2, and you go, exhaust a guy, bounce K2, ready a resource, possibly play another card. Your opponent could be, like, the game might just be over right then. And that's not counting if you do it on a later turn or, again, multiple times, especially if you follow up on the following turn with a Bosk, with a Bouncer, or even Gamorrean Guards. Crippling. Additionally, speaking of Gamorrean Guards, this card is pivotal because it requires very specific things out of your aggressive opponents in order to address it. Admittedly, this doesn't shine as much in the Mirror, but it can still have great value because it throws off your opponent's math for addressing your Boba Fett, specifically your leader. Protecting your leader in all matchups, but especially the Mirror, is crucial. Notably, opposing Bobas with a surprise strike, guess what? They one-shot leaders. So having the guards, yeah, it will die, but keeping your Boba Fett alive is crucial. If you cannot get the readies, the untaps on your resources, it can really disrupt the flow of your game plan. As mentioned earlier, you really need to be playing multiple cards a turn, as many turns as possible. Every time you do that, you get ahead, and you want to stay ahead so that you don't have to try and fight from behind. In all of these, you definitely want shoot first. I love seeing them because it means you can remove a threat while maintaining yours. Those go right up there with the cunnings. Now, maybe not quite at that level, but they are very important. And Waylay can also be very relevant even against, say, Sabines, because a lot of those units, they're somewhat costly for an aggro deck. If it takes their entire turn to play a K2 and you bounce it while still advancing because you have Boba untapping things, you're in a great spot. Just keep in mind, Sabine will get there. To a lesser extent, Leia. If they draw any combination of 3, where it's 4 Cause I Believe In and K2, some combination of those adding up to 3 in a game, you probably lose. Because they're going to deal 11, say, off of those cards. That's a significant chunk of your base life, base health, that you can't interact with. There's no way to stop that. They play those cards, it's going to happen. I guess to an extent, you can address the K2. That's where a No Good to Me Dead or a bounce card comes into play. Cartel Spacer can put in a lot of work there as well. But you really need to be going for the throat early. Maybe use your Boba turn to stabilize, get rid of multiple things, and then close the game out 1 or 2 turns after that. Because if you don't, you're going to die. You're not going to be able to go into the late game because they will eventually find those cards. While that probably sounded very doom and gloom, there are some other options that you may not realize. Bodhi Rook can actually strip away, at the very least, the 4 Cause I Believe In. And of course, in the Mirror, nailing a cunning feels awesome. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Disintegrator. It puts in a lot of work in all of these matchups, but especially against Leia and Sabine, because you could tap down the leader and then nuke it in one attack. Shifting from aggro, let's talk about mid-range builds. Now, this could be Boba Greens, which are a very uncomfortable matchup. It could be Hans, it could be Chirrut, it could be Luke. There's a variety of different things that are occupying this space at the moment. And there's a few things you got to keep an eye out for, as well as a few things you want to make sure that you employ. The biggest commonality for all of these matchups is how leader-focused they are. Now, I mentioned earlier that Star Wars Unlimited in general is leader-focused. However, these matchups in particular really emphasize it because disrupting the hero turns can be catastrophic, both for them and for you. And that's why probably the most important piece you have is no good to be dead. Now, I say that with the caveat that your curve is equally important. If you do not apply pressure, if you do not actually try and end the game because you missed a drop here or there, because you hard mulliganed for no good to be dead, and then ended up with like triple Bosk no good to be dead at a fire spray or some horrendous hand like that, you're probably not winning that game. However, you can absolutely set them back eons by leaving 2 resources open and then playing this weird game of chicken where you're going to have to pass. They're not going to want to play something, so they try and dirtle. You pass again, and then you eventually hit them with no good to be dead, or they have to just accept that their turn is crippled. And they take initiative and just not do what they want to do. But stopping Boba from getting an overwhelming board position by doing the same thing you want to do, stopping Han from ramping to 7 and then playing U-Wings or Han units, stopping Chirrut from getting out there and wreaking havoc on your board, and of course Luke doling out shields to anyone and everyone. Now, while there is that commonality between these different matchups, they do vary in what other cards are relevant. For example, a lot of Luke decks are running different lightsabers to empower Luke. You need to keep an eye out for that on your Boba deployment turn so they don't have a Luke just run it in and crush him. Similarly, in the Chirrut matchup, you want to be careful of Force Throw. They have 1 resource up. That means that there's probably a Force Throw and Redemption, meaning a dead Boba. Can you win from those positions? Sure, but obviously your life is way more difficult when you aren't getting the ready resources. In all matchups, you absolutely are the aggro and you have to end the game quickly before their powerful cards come online. That could be U-Wings, that could be the Han unit, as mentioned before. It could be a variety of different things that once your opponent stabilizes, they've got the game locked up because you can't actually push what you need to. Keep in mind that you do have a number of pump spells, such as Surprise Strike, the aforementioned and repeatedly mentioned Cunnings, and of course, you are a lower to the ground deck list than these other ones. So you can apply pressure, you can get there. You just have to dodge certain things and make sure that you're prepared for what may be coming at you. Of course, Bodhi Rook, again, plays a pivotal role in a variety of these, stripping away certain tools and allowing you to preemptively protect certain cards from their potential removal. The last set of matchups we're going to discuss are the control decks, and I don't love these. The big issue here is specific builds of control decks. Now, they also have a wide range. You could have Vader builds, you could have Palpatine builds, there's Iden, there's Krennic, there's this, there's that. And at the end of the day, you're okay seeing generally the ones that are not monocolored. The reason for that is they don't necessarily represent the same tools, namely cheap vigilance. That it's really just the mono blue ones that are the big issue. That's not to say that the other ones don't pose a challenge, but you can absolutely overcome them because they have to pay a penalty for vigilance or some of their other tools. The big thing about all of them is that they will trade frequently 1-for-1 with your bodies. You play a guy, they play a removal. You play a guy, they play a removal. And this continues until they can finally turn the corner. Your big assets here are Shocker, Cunning, and Bodhi Rook. The big thing is that although you're drawing 2 cards a turn, these decks want to resource every single turn. So you stripping away cards deals damage to them in 2 different ways, aside from maybe literal damage when Bodhi attacks. You're depriving them of resources and or resource drops. So when you strip away their removal card, that means one of your guys lives a little bit longer, maybe to another full turn because you took away takedown and they can't actually play the Vanquish that's in their hand this turn. something along those lines. But additionally, this makes their rowing decisions much more difficult. You need to be hitting their hand as often and as you possibly can while still applying pressure. Additionally, while cunning is super strong, you can't play it in the same way in this matchup. The reason being is that it is way too easy for them to set up a power of the dark side, a make an opening, or something along those lines. Cunning onto a 7th fleet is great against other decks. It's asking to get 2 for 1 here because they're just going to make an opening. They're going to power the dark side because they killed your other guys. They're going to hit it with a takedown or whatever the case may be. So you need to be very, very cautious about when you go for the cunning, unless you're playing it simply to bounce and remove a card. And the sequence on your cunning plays is also going to be important because it will matter whether you put the card back in their hand first or whether you strip it away first. Similar broken record, you have to hit the ground running, especially here. This is the matchup, and I'll talk about this at the end, for things that I wanted to change about the deck. This is a matchup that I have been heavily considering returning to TIE Fighter LN or some other early drops. While those cards are, well, they suck. There's no way to sugarcoat it. They're bad. They do mean that you can possibly generate multiple bodies on a turn. So while those decks being the control decks, frequently will not have that many bodies out on the board for you then to remove, it is not uncommon for them to try and slam a Lieutenant Chilton. You waylay it, and all of a sudden you're able to then also play a Greedo, or in this case, maybe a tie, or whatever the case may be. Or even on turn 1, going Greedo tie might be valuable. I have not tried this yet, and I'll touch on it again later, but the idea is that you want to squeeze in as many units as you can to ensure that they're 1-for-1 removal that effectively takes up their whole turn. If they play Power of the Dark Side, they're probably not playing Takedown in the same turn, certainly not early. If they remove one but leave the other, that means that there is a body to carry a Surprise Strike, carry a Cunning, carry a whatever, and continue to pressure so that way your discard can mean something. The other big thing is, of course, Super Laser Blast. Now, a lot of people will utilize Bodhi to try and take that away. I tend to play Bodhi more aggressively, and I want to strip away, even if it's just an entrenched, something to disrupt their turn now. The reason being is because if they take an entire turn off to Super Laser Blast, and I can slam a Fett's Fire Spray, which by that turn you've seen a lot of cards, it's not unlikely. Somebody else will do the math. But if you have the Fett's Fire Spray to answer post Super Laser Blast, you feel really good about that. Now, if you've been stripping their hand this entire time, it can be even more difficult for them to continue resourcing and get into the Avengers and the Devastators or the other Star Destroyers or other large things that they want to be doing. Regardless, this is still about tempo. It's still about timing, and you still need to get there. You need to manage your resources. Don't feel bad about, for example, surprise striking a Boba Fett unit into a big Childson to remove it. At the end of the day, you need to clear that Childson. You can't wait around and just pass turn and not get the damage in, especially against Vigilance decks. That's why Mono Blue Iden might be public enemy number 1 for this build. It is, I don't want to say trivial for that deck to control the board, but because Vigilance only costs 4 there instead of 6, and the Vigilance can remove a huge chunk of this deck, it is absolutely crippling. And then, of course, whether it's Entrenched, it's Vanquish, it's Takedown, it's Make an Opening, it's this, it's that, eventually they stabilize and can take over the game. And regardless of how they are closing the game out, it's just big cards. Big thing hits the board, and the game shuts down for you. So you need to, as I've said before, close the game out before they hit their important cards. And it's going to be appropriately managing that you don't get hit with Power of the Dark Side on Boba Leader. You don't get hit with removal on your Cunning, and you also try and attack both their hand and life total as much as you humanly can. Although I'm not thrilled to sit down against a control deck, you can manage it as long as you are consciously aware of what removal they may play on what turn and what they are likely trying to set up. Of course, getting a few peeks at their hand with Bodhi or Probe Droids certainly helps in this respect. The last two things I want to talk about are sideboarding as well as any changes I want to make to the deck. So starting with the latter, to be perfectly honest, the main deck feels pretty great. There's a few things that disappoint me from time to time, namely swoop racers, but there's just not a lot in a set one meta that you can swap it for. We're going to come back to that momentarily, but I do of course have to mention one other change that I had had in previous versions, because as I said at the beginning, Poem and You Can Call Me Al were running more vehicle heavy, Mining Guild ties, Frontier ATRTs, and the card that I really want to highlight, and that's Outer Rim Headhunter. I had that in the Viper Probe Droid slot for a long time. It enables more Cartel Spacer plays, and as I've found, many decks in the meta currently are pretty soft in space. So you could play a Headhunter on turn 1, and it may do 8 or 10 damage because they just ignore it. And if they don't address it and you're able to get Boba out, you can definitely disrupt their turns by stealing actions here and there. I've done it in a ton of games. I wouldn't rely on it. And of course, if your opponent has ECL and they're a Boba, 7th Fleet eats it. Sabine could just send an A-Wing into it, and they kind of don't care. It's not great unless your opponent just completely leaves it alone, but it is something to consider. As mentioned, I might want to try and squeeze in the ties, shave a couple of things, but it's very tough because you want to take game 1, and having this stable of a main deck is important for that, because while some things are not great in certain matchups, say No Good to Me Dead against Palpatine, you still can get a lot of value out of these things, even where they aren't necessarily ideal. As a result, I kind of want to leave the main deck alone. It's really just trying to find an appropriate 1-drop to squeeze in there to help out with the control matchups, but maybe it should go into the board. So that segue is about as good as it's going to get for this sort of thing. I will preface the sideboard with this. It is generally more about removing pieces that you don't want to see, you don't want to draw in a particular matchup, than it is bringing in better things. Now, you're certainly bringing in tools to help, but it's generally about trying to get, say, No Good to Me Dead out when you don't want it in that matchup. In my experience, I brought in Jabba in literally every game. I don't love Jabba. I put him in the swoop racer category of, like, he's fine. He definitely is a big body. He's sturdy, so it's difficult for your opponent to remove him, and therefore he can carry surprise strikes or cunnings. I guess it's very easy to get surprised by a giant space slug, I guess. I don't know. But the point is that these guys, they come down, the filtering and the search is not, it whiffs a lot. So don't expect to hit it, but when you do, it's an extra resource drop, great. Like I said, the idea is to bring events that you don't want out when you want other stuff in. Because the main deck is so tight and so streamlined, you really don't want to mess with it too much. Now, the confiscates come in whenever there's a suspected traitorous and or entrenched. Generally, I only bring in 2. You don't really have the slots to remove in order to bring stuff in. The Syndicate lackeys have at best been lacking. I'm not a huge fan of those, and I probably will shave a couple copies, maybe a copy of Confiscate, 1 or 2 copies of Lackey, and probably a copy of Change of Heart to make room for other things. I generally don't want to board in 2 Change of Hearts. I know other people do, and I've definitely seen and talked to people who swear by the double Change of Heart. I used to do that. I've kind of leaned into, no, I'm just, if I have the Change of Heart, great, but it's essentially an extra copy of thing, whatever that thing happens to be. In a lot of cases, that's Waylay, because you're really just removing a Sentinel, you're removing some obnoxious piece from their board temporarily, maybe to help push damage at the end of the game. But because of the cost, and it's kind of clunky, and it just gets weird. Generally, you just don't want to remove any bodies. You want to swap out events and free up space where you can. So I tried to keep this short, and it went much longer than I thought. If you're interested in more of my thoughts, feel free to leave a note in the comments. I'll either hit up another video, or if you want to join the Discord, ask me there. That works too. But like I said, we're going to be trying to get more Star Wars Unlimited on stream, and I'm going to try and hit up as many more of the showdowns as I'm able. And certainly the events at Gen Con, as long as we can make it. But that's going to do it for this one. As always, everybody, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Tune in next time for more Random's Thoughts.